Bloomberg Green and Sustainability Events.
Joining us from other parts of the world, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Bloomberg Sustainable Business Summit, the world's most sustainable office building. So it's fitting that we're hosting here. We've got a great program ahead focused on some of the innovative ideas joining us. A couple of quick announcements before we get started. For our virtual attendees, if you experience any issues with all of you today, if you are submitting a question, QR code behind me. It's also located throughout the room outside and the networking area. Also engage with us on social media using the hashtag SustainableBizSummit. Speaking of social media, leading up to the summit, we did kind of engage the Twitterverse on a couple of questions just to poll where they are on some of the issues that we are focused on for prioritizing in 2022. Right, and you can see kind of the majority of people seem to be focused on diversity and inclusion, with human rights kind of creeping up. I think maybe with the situation that's going on currently, that one rise to the top a little bit as well. So very interesting to see. I don't know if you guys, yeah, great. Human rights. First session of the day. Our first two speakers are very focused on the S in ESG along with other parts of sustainability. And they have Elizabeth Nyeko for a conversation with Bloomberg's Lizzie Burden.
Okay, well, thank you, Meg. Welcome to this economy reporter here at Bloomberg. Now, so it's a real pleasure to have these two women next to me because they embody all of those characters. Elizabeth Nyeko, thank you so much for joining us at Bloomberg's European headquarters. The question for all, and that's been the mission of both your businesses. So, Simi, in the beauty industry that you're trying to tackle?
Well, I mean, there are a couple. So I think that we were curating conscious and sustainable beauty brands because I was that customer that found it really difficult to discover brands in a real way that actually resonate source in terms of the ingredients. Consumers these days, and there's more than 64% of them that want to shop consciously and sustainably, but cannot because there's so much fragmentation in that buying journey. So I guess with that side of it, but using AI to kind of match people to products like in a real way, so that they actually worked for them, because there's this incredible amount of waste. I think it was in lockdown, 3.3 billion. Over 25% of that were products that were just thrown away and were unused because we were using AI and AR tools and all of these aspects as well. And that didn't happen. So 860 million is what we're talking about in terms of products that were just thrown to the side. So there are that. Because I was one of those consumers. I still am that consumer.
Elizabeth, your business is also about catering you.
So we're essentially looking at a world where being into renewables and go out and kind of invest into renewables. We see a world where rather than kind of utility scale centralized renewables, there is a space for kind of off-grid smaller scale renewables being funded. Now, the issue is out there now, but on the side of kind of the institutional investors, they're kind of thinking there's the sort of traditional your renewable asset investments, especially you'll have a portfolio. So if you reduce your ticket size beyond a certain amount, then you have this portfolio of assets in lots of different locations, complexity to contend with on a technical level. And so relying on kind of old school approaches of doing surveys, boots on the ground inspections, testing, audits, that sort of thing. If you really want to go from happy kind of generating energy, you need to be able to address those concerns around risk. So first, the sort of operated for these institutions to be able to better manage environmental risks. These are kind of leading indicators of cash flow risk for any renewable energy portfolio. So where we come in essentially is a combination of institutions to be able to access just the sorts of information
you must have to collect that you both started off in med school. Simi,
the most untraditional career, whereas matching PRs and brands with celebrities, media and influencers to drive brand awareness. With media and influencers, that per treatment, and then doing that in driving brand the right products or businesses to the right assets to pivotal for AI. And I had this amazing routine, and I was leveraging my scientific background. So it was like, yep, this is the right ingredient, this is the right to work for me. And it just stopped working, and I didn't understand why, because, you know, I'd looked in 26 years old, director in this business. You know, how did you get there? And she was like, so it was then that I was thinking, actually, what if I could use this AI, this little known like branch of computers, and it took years of kind of crowdsourcing data, because in order to build and deploy models, or that the correct output and the most accurate prediction is.
In training to be a doctor and founding Modularity.
So yeah, I also started off in med school. I think for me, the sort of contribution during my lifetime, 1,000 lives. But if I went back to university, learned research and ways to kind of address this bigger energy access, links to healthcare benefits, links to educational benefits. And so that was kind of a great way for me to really amplify. I thought it was a great way to, just working, just the mechanics of everything. And it was me, and that company essentially does what a property developer does, but for renewable. One of the partners of the UN FAO, funded by the likes of FMO, where I realized kind of the limited level of visibility that people with renewable energy, kind of batteries are real processes, how the external environment affects the battery. The moment you've installed the battery, its state of health starts changing there and then. It's already in a state of decay. And so you have most of the resources. So yeah, so that basically was my journey. And so I was able to kind of look at things from the perspective of the kind of finance aspect, and then also look at things from the engineering aspect, and bring that together.
For so long, the beauty industry has catered to the lowest common denominator. So now that you're for the company,
I think we're already seeing that, you know, AI and AR is somewhat mainstream. The dream for UT is to be, it's this marketplace, it's this one-stop shop kind of destination. The same thing for UT, you know, and the same way that people say, hey Siri, how do I bake a cake? Because I know beauty doesn't need this level of personalization. Out on a wide sample of people have one side. So, you know, being able to recognize someone's, realizing how that can impact whether a product really support us in doing that, and it has been doing so. And that's why we read Big Beauty or anyone deploying and building AI can do, or we're not embedding biases into the models or thinking that, even though I returned back to university, I returned to Oxford to study AI, that you even think that was quite innovative, and what consumers are striving for.
Diversity of thought to them at the end, hopefully. Elizabeth, for Modularity Grid, you've talked about the data that you're collecting. I wonder who your customers are and how you use data to...
So then our customers are fundamentally kind of on the one hand, sort of financial institutions, farms, for example, you know, with the current situation, and you know this loss of the direct payments to help them. So really kind of bringing down necessarily on the radar for investments, just because the cost of kind of really high. So the issue that extract that engineering data, so data from the different components of these different systems in different locations, and Barclays or metrics in terms of uptime, with all the various kind of operational maintenance. Well, you know, he said, which means you can reduce the size of these investments, because the grid is old. I mean, yes, there's a grid in the UK, but it's a decentralized model for energy, and so we think that with energy security, where, you know, whether it's be a farm or data centers or around them, and it's a great way to. In Wiltshire, they essentially bring down their costs by about 50%, around 25%. That's a huge win, especially in a scenario.
Modularity Grid can help to solve this cost of living crisis in its full CEOs. What's been... Simi, I'll go to you first.
Of Black female founders, that's with my UT's thesis, you know, our objectives, where we were hoping to go. of, investment in this short period of time. We are building something that is proprietary, it's deep tech. So, of course, UT to be and what the vision of UT was going to be, and they saw that. And so we're all kind of the same inside. I think, they understand supportive since.
And how about you, Elizabeth?
Yeah, so that's a great example of there you go. For founders who also happen to be Black and female, to raise of founders who've even managed to raise that kind of seed round, let alone. But I suppose for us, kind of, my journey was more about, because I came in very much from the tech angle, because I'd already set up another company before to try and kind of work on a particular problem. And so kind of off the back of that, really, was in that kind of a research lab. It's all about your technical, it's all about you get funded. And then from there, we got a follow-on round of funding, again, another grant, this time from Innovate Seed. And so then at that point, I thought, phew, you know what? I'm kind of keep making progress without necessarily, but obviously you get to a point where you, and I suppose at that stage, the stage where we're at now, to get the sort of levels of capital, the levels of support, the level.
It's fantastic to see your businesses thriving. Meg, I don't think we're going to have time for questions, do you? For joining us, to meet Elizabeth, it's wonderful to...
It's a powerful, it's reaching financial means business.
Please welcome investment managers and Natalie Wallace, Global Head of Sustainable Investing at Natixis Invest.
I'm so pleased to be with you today for our first Advisory Board Spotlight, sponsored by Natixis. And Joseph, I want to start with you about that. When we say ESG investing, I think there's so many approaches to that. It's such a...
Yes, indeed, effectively, it always starts with a conversation with banking distributors towards, pushing products toward end customers. So the conversation goes for a long time, actually, and about clients. First is to try to identify the client's ESG preference. What do they want from an ESG standpoint? It requires a long discussion with them. It depends, again, on the customer. Companies may have some physical risks. Some would like to effectively reduce the temperature of their portfolio, so on and so forth, that client. And then we come up with, once we understand the client needs on those two aspects, we come up with solutions that are tailored to their transition, which creates a great opportunity for them to eventually allocate their money differently and enter into that. Also give them, while promoting products, all the transparency they need in terms of understanding each product. That's pretty much how, which are for sure from a humanitarian standpoint terrible. I was actually 2 weeks ago in Australia and in Singapore visiting clients long term, and clients understand that it's a conversation, frankly, even if it has been disturbed because of the war. There were all of us and then...
On this topic that Joseph just raised about...
Humanitarian crisis, it reminds us, and so if anything, we're still, before the war, there were threats. Now there is a fourth element to that, which is solutions. So all our clients and actions are going to create for investors.
And maybe to add what just Natalie said, I mean, clients are not blind. Despite that, they are still making the difference. It's staying, and it's clear in the mind of clients as well.
We have this title about active investors. So
investment as well as engagement with portfolio do not of the economy. We need to engage with companies, and we've seen through many actors really have an impactful engagement and proxy voting season to remove few board members, enable future the portfolios of our clients, as well as affect change within the...
With clients. And then when we talk to them, so the first question, the maturity of clients is definitely... but I can tell you that, again, having more active investing in their portfolios and being accompanied, reallocating their money differently, but they are doing it because they look at the risk attached to not doing it. Same insurance company, I dialogue with my risk manager, because the risk is observing what I'm doing money today compared to the past, and how can I effectively bring the rest of the company with me in doing so. So bring their own internal ecosystem into that journey.
Yes, open the hood and look in the products. I mean, transparency, we've heard all about the risk of risks. Is it to contribute to long-term, but communication, transparency, reporting are extremely important. Is embedded into that product. They are all under huge scrutiny. Becoming true now in the US with the SEC that is expected. Really critical is increased transparency on that, and then European as well next years.
Moving forward, I think us as asset managers or intermediaries, what is at stake, and how do they want to also express their own ESG preference, what's the risk attached to it, will be key moving forward.
Emma Champion, Head of Regional.
To share a very exclusive. This is Christiana Figueres. She was a lead architect of the Paris Agreement, and she is one of the main reasons that we talked about the exponential curve of solutions, economic tipping points that are driving decarbonization. So here we have electricity generation in BNEF's economics-led baseline. This is thanks to their economic competitiveness by 20 prices. And gas is also falling out of the mix as renewable demand side, fifth of all of our electricity demand by 2050 in this economics-led here in Europe. But of course, in reality, we still have a lot of fossil fuel by just a third out until 2050. But in our decarbonize every single sector consuming energy by 2050. That would require, and they are electrification and hydrogen. And the reason we've done this is to have a deeper look in light of the current energy crisis, ongoing dependence on gas. Executive Vice President Timmermans of the Europe out, what that path looks like is even more, and green hydrogen as solution relies on rapid adoption of electric vehicles. Zero scenario to nearly double and across our seasons. For example, electric vehicles could charge dynamically during low price hours, and that can help to smooth that curve of demand across the day and help us to integrate more renewables on the grid. More demand, of course, means more clean power is needed. Wind and solar are driving 75% of power supply by 2050 in this scenario, and that's being supported by the increasingly competitive nature of battery storage in the system. But this scenario really tests the limits of what wind, solar, and storage can actually do for the grid. By the mid-2030s, these three technologies are supplying 70% of our power by 2035. But the progress from there, as you can see here, starts to stagnate. And that's because we need something else to provide clean backup to the grid during lulls of wind and solar output. In our net zero scenario, hydrogen is playing that role. That results in a short-lived transition period for natural gas in the power system as green hydrogen becomes the primary source of backup to the grid. That means almost every single new gas power plant that we're building would need to be hydrogen compatible, and conversions of existing gas power plants may need to also be considered. Now that leads quite nicely onto my thoughts for our second climate solution, green hydrogen. Now, we are expecting green hydrogen to need to supply around 22% of final energy here in Europe by 2050. That equates to around 100 million metric tons of clean hydrogen, which is roughly 10 times what Europe currently uses in fossil hydrogen. The main drivers, as you can see, are industry. We also have a little bit of hydrogen coming into the building stock, and of course that power sector for the balancing. Now, I really want to stress that producing this much green hydrogen in Europe really would require a lot of extra clean energy capacity to be delivered. We found that Europe would need around 1 terawatt of electrolyzers and 1.5 terawatts of wind and solar to deliver all of its green hydrogen needs by 2050. And let's be clear, that is a lot of additional build. We did look at ways that you could try and reduce the amount of renewables that you need by, for example, allowing electrolyzers to charge from excess wind and solar on the grid. But even then, you still need 1.2 terawatts of extra renewables on the grid in order to deliver that much green hydrogen. Now, this opens up really important questions about the future of a hydrogen economy in Europe. Where are we best to locate production? What does this mean for infrastructure, transport, storage? What are the potentials for trade? Now, I want to leave you with two final thoughts. Building all of this renewable energy capacity in Europe is going to need a lot of land. Depending on where we produce our hydrogen, our net zero scenario would rely on anywhere between 1.7 and 3% of land to be used for renewables, up from just 0.2% today. This isn't an impossible task, but it is really important that we consider how we approach permitting bottlenecks, how we approach public acceptance of renewables as we progress. Lastly, the transition will rely on scaling investment into clean technologies, particularly wind and solar. In our net zero scenario, we found that new capacity to provide electricity and hydrogen production creates the opportunity for $5.3 trillion of investment in the coming 3 decades. That will rely on really robust investment signals to the energy industry, which presents really big challenges, but really big opportunities too for policymakers, for companies, and for investors that are navigating the transition. And as a clean energy analyst, if hindsight is anything to go by, that exponential curve of solutions will continue to present all new sources of disruption as we continue to decarbonize the energy system. For those of you with BNEF access or a Bloomberg terminal, our full report with all of the data and the 8 regions that we modeled as part of this report and the slides from today's presentation will be available next week. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma. That was amazing, very informative. So we're going to take a quick. So actually, it's time for us to take a quick break. So go out, stretch your legs, grab some coffee, and we'll be back here around 11:15 with Mayor Khan. Thank you so much.
blinded by the lights. We came to shine here. Watch it look daytime in the night. We bring the vibes here. We full of life, you keep the change, keep the change. They hate and say we went and changed. Why stay the same? You must be blinded by the lights. You must be blinded by the lights, lights. Yeah, 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 yeah. Oh, yeah, 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 yeah. Oh. We put the nets up in the lines, now we high, high, high. Kaleidoscope of colors beaming from our eyes, eyes. Would've thought was LSD, LSD. Can't lose my mind like Kennedy, Kennedy. You see us cooking recipes, recipes. You hit the top, all you left with is the memories. Yeah, 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 yeah. Oh, yeah, 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 yeah. Oh, go hard to have it is your purpose. We had some faith, then who gon' hurt this? I naughty night, you lullaby. I'm doing me, it's do or die. You must be blinded by the lights. We came to shine here. Watch it look daytime in. You must be blinded by the lights, lights. think something new under the sun. You can't take back them things you already done. No. You blame things that you do on somebody else. No. But they all see is you need help. Oh, but still you try so hard to cover up your games. You try so hard, hoping that one day something gon' change. You waste all of your time covering up your tracks. Spend all your days running away. Now you gotta watch your back, and that's the facts. You spend so much of your life scheming and trying to get over. Got you wondering why you come around. All you get is cold shoulder. Yeah. You try so hard to cover up your games. You try so hard, hoping that one day something gon' change. You try so hard. Yeah. You try so hard. You try.
Welcome back, everyone. So just as I mentioned, we're going to be sharing a couple of polls from the Twitterverse that we did in advance of this event. So we have our next poll that I wanted to also check with you all on, because I think it's an interesting one. Will Europe's energy crisis help or hurt the clean energy transition? And as you can see, kind of split on this one, with help just a little bit ahead. So I'd love to see in this room, what do you think? Help? Raise your hands for help. All right. Hurt? Okay. So this room also, help is the winner, which I think we're very optimistic, and I love that. That makes me very happy. Also, talking about this topic of interest, the issue currently at the top of mind of our next guest also for this one, and he needs absolutely no introduction. Here to talk more about this and London's accelerated pathways to net zero, please welcome C40 Cities Chair and Mayor of London, Mayor Sadiq Khan, for a conversation with Bloomberg TV's Anna Edwards.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction, and welcome, Mayor, to
be here.
to Bloomberg, and thank you very much for coming to talk to us. And welcome to you all to Bloomberg. It's a while since I did an in-person event, so this is a special thrill this morning. So welcome to the Bloomberg Sustainable Business Summit. We have 20 minutes of conversation up here on the stage, and then there is time to ask questions. There's a process for asking questions through the app, so please do that, and we can get any questions you have to the Mayor this morning. So it's interesting that we're just starting our conversation, Sadiq, just on the back of that poll and that question about how the current news, the dreadful events we're seeing, the war in Ukraine, clearly that is a humanitarian crisis there and beyond. It's also a cost of living crisis that's turning into one in very many parts of the world. And so that has many people asking, does that delay our transition to cleaner energies? Does it hinder it? Or does it make us double down and speed up? I'd just be interested, as you've set tough targets for London, how you feel about that
Well, firstly, Andrew, it's been a while since I've done an in-person event, and I'm told the first thing you're supposed to do is check if Will Smith's around. And if he's not, you can chillax. But
I don't make those kind of jokes, so we should be safe.
I think there's a number of responses to what's happening in Ukraine with Putin's barbaric aggression. One of those is to think that gives us a clean pass to do more exploration for gas and oil, to begin fracking and so forth. The other response is the one I think you see from those who responded to the polls, both in the room and on Twitter, which actually this should accelerate the speed with which you get to renewables, to solar and wind, which is actually cheaper. But actually it reminds us that actually energy security is really important. Yes, of course, tackling climate change is really, really important. Getting to zero carbon is really important, but actually energy security is really important as well. You can't have a situation where Germany is going cap in hand to Russia, or our Prime Minister is going to Saudi or elsewhere to have more hydrocarbons. And I think the invasion of Ukraine should make us even more keen to get to zero carbon, should make us even more keen to make the adaptations and invest in renewables. Okay. And I think actually it is a wake-up call to those of us in the global north.
Okay, so it's useful to set our conversation in that reality, and day in and day out we're hearing about this kind of news and reporting on this kind of news, so it's important to sort of check in with you on that. The pathway to net zero then, you've set targets for 2030 for London, so these targets are coming closer, aren't they, which is really fascinating to see how well we can do on that front. Let me start by asking then, go through a few areas, and one of those is the built environment and buildings and what we do about those. Of course, everybody wants to see better insulation and different energy sources in people's homes, but how realistic are the targets you set on that front? Because who pays for all of that? What is your assessment of who pays for better insulating Londoners' homes?
Yeah, well, look, if you break it down, there are three basic areas where you have carbon emissions. One is transport, one is where people work, and one is where people live. Now, we're lucky, we're in probably the greenest building in the world, this building. And you can do that when you're starting from scratch. But we've got a big issue in relation to retrofitting buildings and how we travel as well. And I think it's going to be a partnership between the public sector and the private sector. I think, by the way, there is a first mover advantage in those cities and those businesses that move on this for obvious reasons. And so it's a combination. What we've done in London is to have a target to get to zero carbon by 2030 with a roadmap how we get there. And a lot of that is adaptations of our buildings, you're right. So what we've done at the same time is set up a number of funds of money to assist the private sector. So one of those is a London Climate Financing Facility, and another one is the Mayor's Energy Efficiency Fund. And the idea is we leverage in using public sector money, private sector money, innovation, use economies of scale, work with those, for example, those who live in municipal housing. There's an opportunity there for mass retrofitting in relation to insulation, double glazing, in the walls, solar panels, heat pumps, district heating. And we're also looking into green bonds as well. And I think there's a real opportunity in us going first. Just think about the jobs we could create, in relation to who's going to fit the solar panels, who's going to fit the electric vehicle charging points, who's going to fit the double glazing, who's going to do the loft insulation. So we're also working with the skills sector to train up Londoners for these future-proof jobs. I think it's a virtuous circle. And as far as the business community is concerned, we're working with not just Bloomberg's, but many others in the city about the opportunity for them in relation to if they're in a building that's not the most energy efficient, how you can take action now. And I make this point. Anna. Look, the costs of inaction when it comes to the economy, livelihoods, the environment, and the health are far greater than the costs of action in relation to tackling the climate emergency and reducing the toxic air.
Do you think that that is a persuasive enough argument to persuade private landlords, for example, to put in the necessary investment? That must be quite a challenge in London. You talked about municipal housing. There are clearer pathways, perhaps, to improve that housing stock. But is it harder with private rented, that sector?
Yeah, it really is. And so I'll give you an idea of the numbers. So in London, about 2.4 million Londoners rent in the private sector. 2.4 million. And unless we can incentivise the landlords to take action, you can understand why a tenant, A, can't afford to insulate, but B, there's no incentive. And that's why we're trying to lobby the government to do more in relation to the private landlords, even though the government's announced some policies in the budget to assist in relation to zero VAT. If you're a landlord, there's no incentive because you're not paying the bigger bills. It's the tenant paying the bigger bills. And so we've got to find a way to deal with the private residential that's let out. I think there are easier incentives for owner-occupiers. There are easier incentives for local authorities and housing associations that rent their properties. But you're right, that part of the jigsaw, we've not quite found a way to incentivise a landlord to take action swifter.
And you mentioned the skills gap, and that must be a concern, I suppose, in a labour market that is already stretched, where it's difficult to find builders even with sort of legacy skills, let alone the new ones. So can we quickly scale up those skills to enable people to find people who can install a heat pump?
Yeah, really good question. So one of the things we're doing from City Hall is setting up a number of academies in those sectors which we know are future-proof growth sectors, and the green economy is one of those. We're having green academies across London. We also know in London there's a big issue with underemployment and unemployment, particularly in some communities. Particularly, for example, Black Londoners aren't having access to the jobs that are available. Partly lack of access to the skills, and so we're focusing our green academies in those parts of London where we know there's unemployment, underemployment, to give them the skills for the jobs being created. We are experiencing in London, in relation to employment, both a labour shortage and a skills shortage. And the reality is, look, we can talk about Brexit if you want, but I'm quite confident around the country, many people will still come to the capital city to fulfil their potential. And that's why we've got to make sure there is access to the skills which will lead to the jobs. Our green economy in London's worth £48 billion, right? Roughly speaking, 250,000 jobs in the green economy. We want to double that over the next decade. We want to use this opportunity to create more jobs, and we think we can do it.
We've talked about the buildings, and you mentioned transport earlier. Let's focus in on transport a little bit. I understand that there are plenty of experiments going on around London, aren't there, or trials going on around London for all sorts of things, different types of charging for vehicles in various parts of the capital. Also, road use and different experiments around that. I understand that Waltham Forest is one place where there's quite a lot of experimentation going on. What are we learning? What are the early, give us some nuggets that we can take away, the early learnings that we're getting from this about what London's transport needs to look like 10, 15 years from now?
Look, so to get my job, I've got to persuade Londoners to vote for me. And one of the things we realised in 2016 is when Londoners are asked about climate change, they think it's a tomorrow issue, but also an issue that doesn't affect them. So what we've done is turn climate change into a now issue by mentioning the health consequences of the environment. And so we know toxic air leads to premature deaths, thousands every year, leads to people having a whole host of health issues from stunted lungs to asthma, dementia, lung disease, cancer. Now, what we've done by doing that is make Londoners be putting pressure on us to take more action because it's an air quality crisis as well as climate change. And great councils like Waltham Forest are leading by example. From City Hall, what we've done is we have the world's first ultra-low emission zone, and it started in central London, and we saw in central London the toxic air reduced by half in just 2 years. Nitrogen oxide and nitrogen dioxide down by 50%, particulate matter down, carbon down. We've expanded that to inner London. That will lead to a further 30% reduction. And we're consulting in May to have all of London one big ultra-low emission zone, working with councils like Waltham Forest, Hackney and others, to within their boroughs have zero emission zones and other policies. And the great thing is there's pressure from the people to do more because we've made this into a now issue because it is a health crisis rather than a tomorrow issue, but it's also an us issue. It affects us in London.
But this is difficult work, isn't it? Because even with the ULEZ and you're thinking of expanding then the ULEZ even further, even with that, we still have days where your office has to say, look, the air quality is not great out there, guys. You know, if you're at risk,
progress.
don't go out.
Yeah, that's progress. So in 2016, when I first became mayor, we simply didn't know until the end of the year which days were particularly bad. So working with actually Bloomberg Philanthropies, we now have more air quality monitors across our city than any city in the world. Why is that important? Because what Breathe London has done is we can get real-time information how good or bad things are. Now, anybody here suffers from hay fever, you look at weather forecasts, you know there's a high pollen count, you can take action. If you've got asthma or other issues, you've got no idea what the air quality is like. So we're letting people have that information so you can then not go for a jog on a main road. You can not push your baby in a buggy on a main road. You can decide not to do things. That information is crucial. What we're doing actually across the world with the C40 cities is giving them this information with the air quality monitors, because the information is really important for you to take action to avoid having the consequences of breathing in this poison.
Yeah. Do you think that the pandemic, you know, it was an incredible and dreadful event to live through, but it also threw up a lot of opportunities for change and for radical thinking. Do you think that London has taken that opportunity to be radical enough when it comes to road use, for example? Right after the pandemic first started, we saw instantly sort of spaces for pedestrians popping up, more space for cyclists popping up, segregated away from traffic. Is there an opportunity to be more radical, though, on that front, in terms of the use that we put these streets to?
Well, look, we know that pandemics have been just awful, both in terms of lives lost and livelihoods lost. But I think it was Churchill who's maybe have said, never waste a good crisis. And I think it's an opportunity, you're right. We saw during the pandemic, air quality improved hugely. We saw during the pandemic people walking and cycling, and so it's led to us doing things we otherwise probably may not have had the chance to do. We have quadrupled the amount of cycle lanes in our city now. There are now almost 300 kilometres of safe cycling. We've widened pavements. We've used the opportunity to do a number of things we probably would have taken us longer to do. And we've got to think about, in a global city where we live, work, play, do leisure, and the pandemics, without a doubt, allowed us to think more about how we see our future. Look, what we're trying to do is, you know, grow back greener and build back better. What does that mean? That means making sure we use the opportunity, and again, apologies for using the word opportunity when it comes to a pandemic, an opportunity to go quicker. And what we're doing across the C40, the C40, for those that don't know, are 97 cities across the globe, mega cities like the New Yorks, the Limas, the Dhakas, the Delhis, the Parises, represent more than 700 million people, more than a quarter of the planet's GDP. What we're doing is across the globe, seeing how we can use this awful pandemic as an opportunity to invest more in the green economies, to have Green New Deals, to make sure we use this awful opportunity, this pandemic, to make sure we don't go back to business as usual.
You've mentioned the C40, so let me linger on that for just a moment. What does London stand to learn from it? Because you've mentioned how we're sharing learning, you're sharing learning from City Hall around Breathe London and around the data that you're able to act on there. What do we learn from London? Because I imagine we must be able to tap into experiences elsewhere about what's working.
Yeah, great stories. I mean, Freetown in Sierra Leone, Yvonne the mayor, has got this massive program of tree planting. And we're replicating that in London, because in Freetown it's important because it stops mudslides and so forth, but also we know the biology in relation to photosynthesis. In Barcelona, AIDA's got a really good street space scheme in relation to using the opportunity created by the pandemic to have less traffic in certain communities, car traffic, and encourage more people to walk and cycle, and that sort of pavement cafe culture. Really important. So we're seeing in North Dhaka that they're looking at how they can use the opportunity created by the pandemic to avoid, people coming to the city centre from the coastal areas because of, there being low lying. And we're working with them about ideas they've got about how they can have high density, good quality housing. So a lot of these principles are transferable. The specific policy may be slightly different, you've got to adjust it, but one of the best things about the C40, it's 97 mayors, is we share best practice. There's a lot of bragging as well, I hasten to add. That's politicians for you. But we do share best practice. So Breathe London is now going Breathe Global. One of the key things we're keen to do as C40, though, is we recognise the global north is responsible for lots of the climate challenges we face. And so what we're going to do is spend more than 2/3 of our budget in the global south, who are least responsible for climate change, face the biggest consequences, and often have the least means. And so we're doing what we can as cities because we're quite nimble. But there's some great ideas around the world that we're trying to pinch.
And, yeah, pinch and share. It sounds fair enough. Let me ask you about fairness, actually, and about social justice, because we've talked a lot about road use and the way we use the space in London. How do we make sure that it's not just those who've got the loudest voices and the deepest pockets who are able to live a healthier life in London? How do we make sure that, for example, with the low traffic neighbourhoods, that traffic that would have gone through those doesn't go to the busy roads? You know, how do we make sure that nobody's left behind on that?
Well, for me, the issue of climate justice is an issue of social justice and racial justice. Why do I say that? Put aside for a second the macro stuff, global south, global north. In London, those least likely to own a car suffer the worst consequences of air pollution. Roughly speaking, half of Londoners don't own a car. And again, so on a micro level, you're seeing social injustice, but also you're seeing in those communities where there's a higher proportion of Black, Asian, minority ethnics have worst air quality, least likely to own a car. And so it's an issue of social justice, actually. And, you know, it may be inconvenient that you've not been able to take the rat run you used to take. You have to go using main roads. But for those residents on those roads, it's a huge convenience because their children are less likely to suffer from asthma or bronchitis or all sorts of health issues and stuff. And so adapting can be short-term inconvenient, but in Waltham Forest, you mentioned, initially when they introduced their cycling policies, a lot of resistance from actually mums and dads who were inconvenienced dropping their kids off in the car on the rat run. Now those same parents are walking, cycling, scootering with their kids to school. Big improvement in air quality. The businesses in those streets are now benefiting from the higher footfall. And so that short-term benefits, and it's really important to take people with you. And so, you know, we had elections this May, mayoral elections, and you know, on the ballot paper, I was quite clear. If you vote for me, you're voting for a Green mayor. If you vote for me, it's more walking and cycling. If you vote for me, it's, you know, more ultra-low emission zones, etc. And, you know, Londoners voted for me in record numbers.
And for some people, those arguments are really persuasive. But what's the most persuasive argument to bring along those people who don't initially share the enthusiasm for ultra-low emission zones and low transport neighbourhoods? How do you convince them that it is the right path?
Well, the evidence helps. And so we point to the evidence about how the ultra-low emission zone has led to our air being less toxic, has led to few people suffering from asthma, few people dying prematurely. But also you look at the economics of this. Look, London is a Roman village that over 1,000 years has expanded and expanded and expanded and expanded. There simply is not enough road space for everyone to jump in their cars. And if we want the roads reserved for those that need to be on the roads, the commercial vehicles, the buses, the black taxis and so forth, you need to get those people off the road who don't need to be there. But the alternative's got to be attractive. So we've got more electric buses than any city in Western Europe, more hydrogen buses, you know, more cycling space, wider pavements, great public transport. Very soon the Elizabeth line will open. And so you've got to make the alternatives more attractive. And we are actually working towards, you mentioned this, Anna, I wasn't ducking it, we're working towards the world's first smart road user charging scheme. It probably won't happen in this term. This term will be expanding ULEZ, I hope, to all of London. But actually, you know, if the polluter pays principle is going to be meaningful, you've got to reward good behaviours. So you pay per mile or per kilometre, depending on the vehicle you have, depending where you're driving to, and so forth. And I think the future in London is smart road user charging. The technology is not quite there. We were the first city in the world to have a congestion charge. We were the first city in the world to have an ultra-low emission zone. I think we're going to be the first city in the world to have smart road user charging.
Okay, do submit questions. One of my colleagues is standing by to pose those to Sadiq on everyone's behalf, so do please keep those coming. I'll just ask one more question to the Mayor whilst we get some more questions in. You talk about road charging in the sense of charging people to use roads. What about charging infrastructure for those who've decided, look, I want to do the responsible thing, I want to have a more energy efficient car, I want to go and get an electric vehicle. and then they find it's very difficult to charge them, and the infrastructure around that lets them down. I mean, is this just an example of where you don't have all the levers at your disposal that perhaps you would like to make London a greener place, Sadiq? But what would you like to see in terms of that charging infrastructure?
So let me say the good news about London. I can't speak for the rest of the country, but in London now we have more rapid charging points. So rapid charging points means you can charge your car in 10, 15 minutes rather than 7, 8 hours. We have more rapid charging points than any city in Western Europe. We're approaching 500 now. And you can get an app and see where the rapid charging points are. We now have almost 10,000 normal charging points across our city, which is about a third of the country's charging points. What we've noticed, though, if you do a sort of bird's eye view of London, not all of London is well covered. So outer London is not as well covered as central London. And there are some corridors that have more than others. So we're trying to improve that. We've set up, it's an awful phrase, an electric vehicle infrastructure task force. I know I wasn't responsible. But we're working with the private sector, we're working with utility companies to make sure we have all of London covered, but also we're making sure that the energy you're using is renewable. It's really important. And also we're using the opportunity, TfL, Transport for London, is the biggest purchaser of electricity in the city. We're also entering into a power purchase agreement to make sure it's renewable stuff we're using as well. But you can be confident in London with an electric vehicle, and we're working with the government to give more confidence up the motorways and stuff, because obviously there's a real nervousness in relation to driving your electric vehicle around the country.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see if we have any questions coming through, Meg.
Yeah, so the first one is about C40 and asking more specifically how city mayors and the private sector can work together to drive climate action in C40.
Yeah, good question. So C40, we do actually work incredibly close with the private sector. We announced that in Glasgow, £1 billion worth of private sector money to electrify the buses in South America. And we're doing more and more work with the private sector, because what we're keen to do across the C40 is to make sure all cities who want to have a Green New Deal, and let's be frank, in the current climate, many mayoralties and national governments are short of funds, and by leveraging in the private sector, we can not work in silos, but do much more. And my view is this: look, there are negative reasons why the private sector want to get involved. Nobody likes economic upheaval. Nobody likes high insurance costs. Nobody likes the issues that come about from flash flooding and so forth. So rather than a negative reason for the private sector to get involved, there's a positive reason, which is can-do mayors. And I think can-do private sector working with can-do mayors are the solution to some of the challenges we face. And actually, just like for mayors and cities, there's a first-mover advantage. For businesses, there's a first-mover advantage as well. We're doing green bonds, so get involved in that. The Clean London, financing facility, get involved in that, and other cities around the world are doing similar things.
What is London doing to prepare for higher sea levels and more common flash flooding?
Yeah. So one of the things that we've got to get our mind around as a country is when you speak to the Environment Agency and they think about floods, they're thinking about floods from the river or from the sea. But actually, we saw last summer flash floods in the city because of the hard surface and so forth. We had stations closing down, we had basements being flooded, and we had Londoners' lives being disrupted. So the upside of these awful problems is it becomes a now problem. And so there's, people get why we've got to deal with flash flooding. So we're working with the water companies, we're working with local authorities. We've now got more sustainable urban drainage. We're trying to turn, concrete jungles green. I planted another tree yesterday. We're planting trees across our city. I feel like the Queen, the amount of trees I plant. But yeah, and so we've got to think about, because cities are facing flash flooding, but also we're facing another phenomenon, which is overheating. So we've got to make sure there are cool parts of our city. We've mapped out our city now in relation to flash flooding now, but over the next 10 years, the bad news is over the next 10 years in London, a quarter of our tubes and stations will be flooded if no action is taken. Hundreds of thousands of homes will be flooded, and many of our hospitals could be flooded. And by the way, they're in the poorer parts of our city.
And this is all by rain?
All by rain.
And you're taking action to protect schools, I understand.
Absolutely. It's really important, yeah. And it's an issue of, mapping out where the, inverted commas, problem areas are, and then taking action to address those: green walls, green roofs, planting more trees, sustainable urban drainage, making sure there's a reason why we're expanding the sewers underneath the city that many of us don't ever experience and stuff, because we need to increase capacity. Look, across the globe, urbanisation means there are more and more people moving to cities. Not per se a bad thing as long as we plan for it.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you very much, Sommer, Sadiq Khan. Thanks very much for listening. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Cheers. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Elizabeth Fernando, Deputy Chief Investment Officer at Nest, and Mark Romano, Head of Impact Private Equity at Mirova, in conversation with Bloomberg's Alastair Marsh.
Hello everyone, and nice to see you. We've got a great panel today. We're talking about climate adaptation, and climate adaptation, of course, is how we prepare for a world of rising temperatures and both the physical and the social ramifications from that. And of course, we could talk about that from a policy perspective, we could talk about that from a science perspective, but we're at the Sustainable Business Summit and you're in Bloomberg's headquarters, so we're going to talk about it through an investing perspective and a markets perspective. And that's great because we have two investment people here on our panel, Liz and Mark. So I want to talk to you both to start off the conversation. In theory, on Wall Street, anything can be made into an investable theme, but is climate adaptation really something that investors can grapple with in a portfolio, have positions around? How can they do that? How do you do that? If possible, there are some examples you can share, and perhaps you could talk more generally about this theme. So how does it become an investable idea? Mark, perhaps to start with you.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Actually, I have the benefit to be in private equities. So we invest in companies that innovate, that develop new solutions. And clearly, climate adaptation is a key thematics. We observe over the last decade a flourish of innovation, of people that try to find solutions. Because actually at Mirova, our conviction is to solve the challenge we all have. Innovation is a core part of the solution. And so selecting companies that innovate and bring solution is an investment theme by itself.
What would be an example of that?
An example, for example, I was this morning with one of our companies named Ombrea. Ombrea, they are agronomists. They have developed a system to adapt the culture against the climate change and the hazard coming with it. So already in Europe, a lot of culture like vineyard are no more adapted to the climate as it is. And so you have to somehow to control the climate. And what they do shadow system to protect the microclimate below the system to avoid too much heat or too much sun and so on. And this company is growing extremely fast. So it's by itself an investment thesis.
And how about you, Liz, more on the public side, perhaps, than the private?
Yeah, so we also have renewables in our portfolio. So we invest in solar farms, which obviously help with the green transition. But on the public equity side, we have a climate tilt on our index tracking fund. And so we are trying to tilt towards companies who we think are well positioned for the transition, and we try and tilt away from companies who we think will have stranded assets, or we don't think their management are taking the challenges that we all face sufficiently seriously. So we try and do it both ways. We also extend that to emerging markets and to our investment grade credit portfolio, because it's very easy for people to say that you deal with it in equities, either public or private. But actually, this is something that matters across your whole portfolio. And restricting access to financing for public companies via the credit markets is probably the most effective way to get change. So we think it's important you apply your standards consistently across portfolios.
So that would be different to we talk a lot about, on our team here at Bloomberg, we talk a lot about the sort of debate of engagement versus divestment. How does that feature here then? So on the credit side, that's not quite divestment, what you're saying, but it is using the levers of the debt market to press companies to do more. That's kind of more ramped up engagement, perhaps?
Absolutely, and I think it's really important as investors we decide, are we trying to target a number in our portfolios? Are we trying to get our carbon footprint down? And that's the end objective, or actually are we trying to drive change? And it's no good to me if I just pass my, I sell a company and Mark buys it. I'm sure Mark's firm wouldn't buy it. But nothing has changed if that's what happens. So we think we need to try and drive change in the economy, just not just focus on numbers in a portfolio.
Very good. Okay. Well, one thing I'm keen to talk to you about, so climate adaptation, we can't really have this conversation without talking about physical risk. It's in the risk of physical manifestations of climate change, whether that be wildfires or flooding and so on. And it seems to me as if the investment community, this is a broad and general comment, has focused much more on transition risk. If we look at GFANZ, for example, a couple of strands of their work is focused on transition plans for corporates and transition plans for financial institutions. As part of the kind of Climate Action 100, 100 plus, their piece of work is also focused on transition planning. The Transition Pathway Initiative is part of what they do. And it seems like there's been a big emphasis on transition risk because that's sort of the thing that's happening right now. And all the net zero commitments are in some way contingent on getting companies to kind of rewire and to change the way they operate. So there's transition risk associated with that. And the assumption has been that physical risk is sort of it's coming, but it's in the background. Do you think sort of recent events, if we're looking at flooding in Australia and wildfire in Australia and California and things that we've seen in Germany, perhaps closer to home, suggest that physical risk is no longer sort of a distant threat, but more of a kind of present reality? I think Sadiq Khan just said something around like it's a now, he was talking about flooding in London as a now problem. Do you kind of think of it in that way, that physical risk has somehow risen up the agenda and requires a greater attention from investors?
Yeah, I think we are in the change. It's not something in the future. So yes, I think with the climate change, you have some new risk. And as an investor, you have to question the company you invest in to check if they have taken into account this new risk. And yes, physical risk is here, and you have to factor in your analysis this risk. I think it's something you have to do.
And is it potentially more destructive to a portfolio than transition risk?
Frankly, it's the same. It's the same. It's just another way to look at the issue. I think maybe when you say transition risk is the ability of your company to adapt and to change its practice, and physical risk is what are the immediate consequences on its operation coming from climate hazard. But at the end of the day, they have to adapt. If you operate an aquaculture farm in a place that will be flooded very often due to the climate change, you have to move it. I think you have to adapt. So it's the same risk at the end of the day.
We're certainly seeing in insurance markets that whether there is actually more physical risk or whether it's more immediate because it's closer to home and therefore we pay more attention to it, I think there's an open question there. Right. And certainly a lot of the places that have been suffering within Europe or within America, they're insured losses rather than being in remote places which tend to be uninsured losses. So you are seeing already the impact on portfolios of those losses coming through. But also you start appreciating the disruption to supply chains. I mean, we've all experienced the COVID disruptions, but there was flooding in Thailand which knocked out semiconductor plants. That caused disruption even pre-COVID. So it's understanding those supply chain challenges for your businesses, I think, is increasingly important.
So, I mean, ESG, which is sort of the thing I'm writing about all day, is in theory I don't know if new is the right word, it's a different way of looking at a company. You're not just looking at the financial metrics, the cash flow and EBITDA, but you're also looking at, what's their transition plan, for example, or how are they treating their employees and how good is their governance. But then with the physical risk, it seems like there might be another important element here, and that is where are their operations? And back to the supply chain point, where are the operations of their suppliers? Do you think that sort of physical climate risk creates a new or necessitates a new way of looking at companies?
I think it increases the importance of, and particularly if you're running concentrated portfolios, it increases the importance of understanding where your firm's operations are, so that you know when to react and perhaps when you don't need to react so much.
But this risk has always existed. It's just the magnitude and the frequencies that have changed that force you to take it into account more. But I think normally when you are, as private investors, we have more granularity and knowledge on the company we invest in, but you have to, since ever, to consider what are the risks of the company you're investing. The difference now is that you have new events that may hit you and that you have to factor in your analysis. So I'm not sure it's totally new. It's just the magnitude has changed.
Okay. And within the concentrated portfolio example that we're talking about, have there been examples where you've had to say to portfolio companies or prospective portfolio companies, guys, you might want to move your operations from this floodplain prone area, this somewhere else?
For us, not yet, but we were close to that. Yes. Okay. But usually, if we also like to invest in companies that are well managed with good manager. And frankly, if it's us as an investor that have to open the eye of the management, maybe you have to question the quality of the management to start with. So to be honest and modest, I think in most of the cases they are fully aware. And we are here to help them. But I think we are not really the eye opener. Otherwise, maybe you shall not invest because the management is not good enough.
Okay. Real estate portfolios are the other place this comes home to roost. So choosing where you put your shopping centre, choosing where you put your office building, and thinking forward to whether those areas are at risk of flooding, which will obviously make them rather less valuable if you can't access them for long periods of time. So I think for real estate portfolios, it's important to be planning ahead. The other example, and I don't have any experience of investing in municipal bonds, but I was shown some really interesting analysis that compared the bonds from two different counties, and the headline pricing was the same, but if you looked at the flood risk between the two areas, they were wholly different. And you might argue that one of those bonds was actually more valuable than the other one. And I think that's a really good example of how this seemingly very intractable problem, you don't know where the flood is going to happen, but if you can see that one county is more at risk of flooding than another one, perhaps you should systematically be valuing those bonds differently to reflect that risk.
Yeah, it was in the US?
It was the US, yeah.
Okay, interesting. Let's talk a little bit about emerging economies, because that seems to be where the climate adaptation and the physical risk is most relevant. It's emerging economies perhaps that will bear the brunt, in theory bear the brunt of rising temperatures perhaps more than others. And of course, as we talk about emerging economies, there's the whole just transition concerns too. And I wonder, as investors, how do you kind of marry those two things, or how do you, walk that line of sort of thinking about investing in emerging economies, the impending climate risk and adaptation coming there, but also the just transition, and how you marry those things? I mean, Liz, perhaps I could start with you there.
Yeah, I think for us, we think very hard about which economies are most at risk, the strength of the financial institutions, the governance structures in those economies. So who is likely to be able to adapt to climate change and mitigate climate change? I think as a developed economy, we have a huge interest in trying to help emerging markets make this journey, because the mass migration that we would see, because those areas are going to become uninhabitable if the worst scenarios play out. And it will be a mass migration of the size we have not seen before. And typically that's not something that goes down very well in developed markets. We tend to close our borders and close ranks at that point. So I think we have a real interest in trying to help countries mitigate climate risk and adapt to it. But we're very keen to only give our money to places where we think it will be spent wisely. We aren't in the business of giving our members money away to places who are going to squander it. So trying to assess who will do well with that money and who will waste it and direct accordingly, I think, is important.
And how do you judge that? That's just regular governance metrics, or?
Yeah, so I mean, there are various people who score strength of institutions and political risks in countries. You can look at where the financing comes from. So our budget deficits, are they going to be able to raise taxes to repay the debt that you're giving them? So you can look at both sides of the equation.
Okay. Mark, did you want to weigh in?
Well, I think we are less exposed. I think if we were to invest in an emerging country, we look at the quality and of the infrastructure of the country to be able to assess also if the company we will invest in are able to operate properly and how they can be impacted by a climate event and change. And also what is very important when you invest is our ability to exit. So yes, having a view looking forward on the ability of the country to adapt is important, because we invest for long term. So investing is easy, exiting is sometimes more challenging. So it's important to consider this part of the risk when you invest in an emerging country.
Okay. And Mark, if I stay with you for a moment, I know that we had this discussion before, that a lot of climate conversations can end up being rather doom and gloom. But you have some thoughts on how one can be opportunistic, or not opportunistic, how one can be optimistic, I mean. Possibly also opportunistic as an investor when looking at climate adaptation.
Yeah, I think nobody wants to take advantage of the situation, but I think we can be optimistic because, as I've said, we have a strong conviction that one of the big characteristics of human being is its ability to innovate and to adapt. So we believe that as investors, we shall support initiatives that innovate to develop solutions. And by doing so, we may actually also have a proper financial return. And also, I think by taking into consideration this non-financial matter, I think we have a better analysis about the quality of the investment. The image I like to use is, if we were in this room in the 50s, we will only speak about financial return. The only consideration was the level of return. Then at the end of the 60s, people discovered the risk. The famous Sharpe ratio was invented in 67. So 55 years ago. And since then, we have all been educated to move in a plan where we look at risk and return, and we look at the efficient frontier of our portfolio. In all the MBA, we learn about how to optimize risk and return. We just discovered that we are not in a plan, but in a cube with a third dimension, which is a non-financial risk. Could it be the environmental, social, physical risk? And so instead of having an optimal frontier on a plan, it's in a cube. So by just taking into account this dimension in your investment decision, you have a better portfolio, because you have a more elaborate view on your risk.
Liz, do you have a view on 3D thinking on portfolio construction?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Mark. I think, and sometimes people say, oh, it's too hard, and I don't know when it's going to happen, and I can't be precise enough. And somebody wiser than me said, if you can see a wave coming, just stand in front of it. And you don't have to be precisely right. You just need to position yourself to take advantage or to benefit from that change coming. So I think getting overly fixated on, is it going to be this year or next year, and is the carbon price going to be 80 or 90 or 120? It doesn't actually really matter. You just need to position yourself so that you're on the right side of that big wave when it happens. We outsource our investment management to asset managers. But we're very much keen on people looking at ways of doing things differently and not keeping that closed mindset of, well, it's always been this way, so it should carry on being this way. The world changes and we need to change with it.
But is the optimistic view then only sort of predicated on developments in technology and innovation?
No, in the ability to adapt. It's not only new technology, it's also to change the way you do things. Maybe to have a better view at your supply chain, to be less energy, to use less energy in your supply chain because you look at it differently. So it's not only innovation. Just innovation is part of the solution, but it's really the ability to adapt.
And within the UK, we look after the pensions we're a workplace pension. We look after a lot of low-paid people. The just transition within the UK is important, and that will throw up opportunities as well, because people like the idea of adapting to climate change and they agree with transition plans, but when they see it might cost them money, they tend to be less thrilled about it. But I think it's up to governments to try and show what's in it for other people and to support that transition so that it genuinely can happen, and there will be great opportunities for investors to support that and make sure everyone goes on that journey.
Very good. Well, I myself have possibly several more questions, but let's open not open the floor, but as Meg, we have some audience questions.
Yes, starting with pension assets represent a very significant portion of assets that are managed globally. How can pension beneficiaries get more involved in the debate on how their savings are being invested?
And that's for you, Liz.
So at Nest, we have just launched a platform called Tomello, which allows our members to see where their money is being invested in the public markets. And that, I think, is a great way of them seeing how we're putting their money to use. Nest has the benefit of only being set up about 11 years ago, and so we're built entirely on technology, new technology. We don't have any legacy systems. And so our communications team and our member engagement is actually, I think, quite easy for people to interact with, and we're quite open about where we are investing their money.
Great. And you kind of answered this, but just to maybe clarify a little bit more, are you investing for profit or social impact at Nest? And if profit, how much does the social impact measures impact your decisions that you're making?
So we absolutely have a fiduciary duty to look after members' financial interests. And so we will always make sure that we are earning a good return on members' money. We think that that's our obligation to do that. But equally, we try and avoid giving money to things which will have negative impact. So one of the phrases that gets used is a bigger pension in a better world. Our members will retire. We are a universal investor. We invest all around the globe in all sorts of different asset classes. And we think we shouldn't leave more damage behind than is necessary.
Yeah, and I think just for Mirova, I think I can say it's the same. We truly believe, as I've said, that you cannot oppose having a positive impact and having a financial return. I think the two have to come together. So it's not a trade-off you do between the two. It's really just in your investment decision to combine the two dimensions together and to have a better return because you have a better impact.
And it plays to sustainability of returns as well. If you If you are a business which is damaging or abusing your workforce or taking advantage of the environment, generally that comes back to bite you. Our members, if they join us at 25, they might retire at 67. We hope that they will have long, extended retirements, but we need sustainable returns from sustainable businesses. That's the best way of serving them, rather than companies who try and make a quick buck, but then they either get forced, they lose their license to operate, or they lose public trust. That's a very bad way of doing business.
Is there a final question, or can I ask?
You go, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, my last question is just to ask you to elaborate a little bit more. I'm very interested in this idea of there being a trade-off or no trade-off between a better world and financial returns. I'm not sure I'm entirely convinced that you can have both at the same time. Convince me if you could in the few seconds we have remaining.
No, it's simply the question of what is the duration you factor in your analysis. Okay, as soon as you have a medium to a long-term view, you have to factor in your sustainable dimension in your investment decision, because, as Liz was saying, otherwise you will not have a sustainable investment. And I think that's the way to reconcile the two, is by adding the time dimension.
Right. Okay.
It's the time that makes the difference. And as soon as you are not short-term traders that want to make money for tomorrow night, but you say, okay, no, I'm here to contribute to the economy with a medium-term view, then you align the financial return and the sustainable impact.
Would you like 10 seconds, the final word?
I never resist the final word.
Very good.
So I think it may not be a better return, but if I can get the same return with less impact, I think that's a result.
That's a win.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, on that note, thank you, Liz, Mark, very much, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, time for lunch. I just want to explain, we have a little bit of something that we're trying that we've done before for this audience. It's called facilitated networking. So at 12:45, basically you're going to go to lunch now, go and eat lunch, but at 12:45, you're going to be looking for the facilitated networking sessions that we're calling COP 26.5. There will be 4 designated networking areas set up in the lunch networking space, kind of behind me here, as I'm a flight attendant. There'll be 2 on each side. Each group will be led by a Bloomberg moderator and focus on the progress on the commitments that we have made at Glasgow and the anticipated discussions that we have coming up at COP 27 in Egypt. So please, you can select one of the topics that interest you. You'll see a sign with the moderator, and you can just join the conversation, and it'll be an opportunity to network with a couple of people in the room about a topic that's most of interest to you. So again, just go ahead, enjoy some lunch out there, and then you can go to the active networking. And then we will come back in here at 1:30 p.m. featuring conversations with the Burberry CFO and COO, Julie Brown, and ISSB Chair, Emmanuel Faber, and so much more. So we'll see you back here at 1:30. Thanks so much.